I'm Aaron Gullius.
And I'm Samantha Engel, and you're listening to Great Lakes Lore,
a podcast where two historians dive into legends of murders, ghosts, cryptids, and more in the Great Lakes region.
Today, we're talking about the haunting history of Mackinac Island, and we have a guest.
Yay!
Hello!
Claire, would you care to tell us a little bit about yourself and why we asked you to be here today?
I don't know. Why did you know? So my name is Claire Herhold. I am just finishing up my PhD in public history at Western Michigan University. Go Broncos! Which is how I know Samantha. And I had the enormous privilege of working for Mackinac State Historic Parks for 6 seasons. I was full-time for 5 seasons as an interpreter on the island. I did 1 winter as a collections intern and outreach interpreter. And then I did 1 part-time season in guest services. So I got to live and work on Mackinac for 6 months out of the year for 6 years. And that was an enormous privilege.
Wow. I was there for 4 hours once.
I spent 1 summer working on the island, which is how I became vaguely familiar with some of these stories, plus some family vacations here and there. The hardcore island folk, they're the ones who know all the good stories.
Yeah. Well, and I should say my history with Mackinac goes back even farther. I was in the Governor's Honor Guard Scout program for 4 years. And my dad was in the Honor Guard as a young tween. So my family has a long history with the island. That was always our go-to family vacation spot. So.
Yeah. Very cool. Well, Claire, we like to start off our podcast episodes with some background for the subject. And so we thought you would be the appropriate one to tell everybody a little bit about Mackinac Island today. So for folks who are not from Michigan or haven't ventured up to the island, what's it all about?
Well, the number one thing to know if you're not familiar is that no matter how it's spelled, it's pronounced Mackinac. we know you're not from here if you say Mackinac.
Yes.
So that's number one. So Mackinac Island is a small island about 2 miles east-west, 3 miles north-south, located in the Straits of Mackinac, kind of right between the upper and lower peninsulas of Michigan and right between Lake Michigan and Lake Huron. And it's an extremely touristy place. It is kind of the go-to tourist spot for a lot of Michiganders and other folks in the Great Lakes. 80% of the island today is operated and owned by Mackinac State Historic Parks. It was Michigan's first state park. It was also a national park. It was the second national park ever created before becoming Michigan's first state park. And it's a system of state parks that not only operates sites on the island, but also on the mainland in the lower peninsula too. But they do own and control 80% of the island. Most of that is trails and beautiful forests and places that most people who visit the island never go, which is, I think, the best part of Mackinac to get out and explore. Mackinac is made of a really unique kind of limestone called Mackinac breccia limestone, which is only found in the Straits, which results in some beautiful geological formations. And you don't get to see those if you just stay downtown. But there is lots of cool stuff downtown too. It's very touristy, lots of shops. And probably most famously, Mackinac has had a ban on automobiles since 1898. So if you go there, get used to horses and bicycles. That's how the majority of people get around, or walking. In the winter, they do use snowmobiles, and there are, of course, emergency vehicles on the island too. There's a small community of year-round folks. It's probably a little bit closer to 400 these days of people who are there year-round. They live in a small area called Harrisonville. There is a year-round school on the island. There is also an airport on the island. In the summertime, that residential population balloons up to 3,000 or 4,000. But the year-round population is quite small. But it's a really unique place. There's some really amazing history that I know we're going to get into tonight, but I can't recommend visiting enough if you've never been.
Very cool. Well, Sam, was it always a touristy place, or was it something else?
So I'm going to give you sort of a brief background here. Well, Aaron and I both are going to, and then you'll hear more about some of these things mentioned when we start talking about some of the stories and legends. So Mackinac Island was formed around, the estimate is 13,000 BC with the recession of the glaciers. About 3.78 square miles with just over an 8-mile circumference, I think maybe 8.5. Archaeological evidence from the island establishes indigenous populations as early as 900 AD. And it's the Anishinaabe people who called the Great Lakes region home. And this name was used for a group of culturally and linguistically related tribes, including the Ojibwe, the Ottawa, the Potawatomi, the Algonquin, the Saulteaux, the Nipissing, and the Mississauga. So all of these different tribes are considered part of this larger Anishinaabe culture. For purposes of Mackinac Island, we will be concentrating on largely the Ojibwe and the Ottawa nations. Now, the name Mackinac itself, if you've seen it, it's got an interesting spelling about it, as Claire alluded to. It's Mackinac, and that comes from the French interpretation of the indigenous word Michilimackinac, which means the place of the great turtle. And so there are some wonderful indigenous stories about the island being the turtle, and the Anishinaabe have a great reverence for the turtle. It has a lot to do with their creation story. But before the arrival of Europeans to the area, the Ojibwe and Ottawa nations fought with the Iroquois for control of the island and the Straits area. You can see how it would be a very opportune piece of land to have control over. And that leads us largely to the Europeans because they all also wanted control of it too.
Yeah, so the first Europeans to arrive in the region were French. The first European structure on the island was a Catholic mission chapel built around 1670. Today, a reconstructed birch missionary hut stands at the edge of Marquette Park, named after Father Jacques Marquette, who established missions in St. Ignace and Sault Ste. Marie. Now, in 1715, the French built a Fort Michilimackinac, on the mainland in Mackinac City, which is on the tip of the lower peninsula, sort of, I don't know, maybe the tip of your middle finger of your right hand, somewhere around there, if you're looking at it that way. After the French and Indian War, which ended in 1763, the British took control of the fort. And then, during the American Revolution, the British moved the fort to the island, renaming it Fort Mackinac, believing it to be more secure on the high bluffs of the island. Now, after the American Revolution was won by the Americans, the British stayed there for various reasons that you kind of get into when you listen to Hamilton. But the Americans take it back after the Jay Treaty in 1796, and they're there until the War of 1812, when the British capture it very easily because the American troops hadn't been told there was a war going on. So, that's just the War of 1812 in a nutshell, really. In 1814, the British would repel an American attack during the Battle of Mackinac on what is today a golf course. During all this time, the island was a very important stop for Great Lakes trade, particularly the fur trade. But by the late 1800s, the island had become primarily a popular tourist destination, and that legacy continues on today.
Yeah, so now we want to talk a little bit about the structure of the episode, because this isn't going to follow our usual nice pattern that I think we've established in our first, however many episodes, 8 episodes, I think, or so we've had now. Mackinac Island is often named one of the most haunted places in Michigan. And given the history we've just related, that's not surprising. We have war, clashes between cultures, be it European and indigenous, and various European cultures too. There's a lot of movement through the island, first for trade and then eventually for tourism. And I mean, especially today, I mean, tourists from around the world come to the island. I worked at Starbucks, so everybody needs their coffee as soon as they get there. And there were loads of different folks who were coming. It's not just a Great Lakes destination. And so people have visited, they moved in, they moved out, just lots of movement. And then the landscape itself, the water, the limestone, people theorize that all of these things kind of hold on to these stories a little bit differently than other types of landscapes. And so there's a lot going on here. And instead of following our usual pattern, we're going to look at different stories that have circulated around the island related to different locations and different kinds of locations. So we have spots connected to war, then we have legends and stories related to some of these natural formations that are on the island, and then other stories more related to tourism. And the one thing that we want to make sure that we're doing is highlighting the actual history of the island, which we hope, we are confident that you will find far more interesting than any made up ghost stories. And we'll talk about that a little bit at the end.
Yeah, and I've got to say, this did start off initially as a sort of Ghost Stories of Mackinac episode, and as we got into it, Sam was like, "Hey, this is nope. I think we can do this differently." The angle that Sam came up with for this episode, I think is fun and is satisfying.
Yeah, and I think being respectful to the real history. I mean, there's real tragedy that happened here, and to make light of that by just making it a fun ghost story that makes you feel creeped out for a few minutes does a terrible disservice to the folks who lived through those horrors, and also to the history profession. To be quite honest, and so we are all history professionals here, and so we'll talk about some of these things as they arise as well.
Yeah, because it is a tragic history, and sort of start off with war and tragedy.
Mm-hmm.
There's a place called Skull Cave, which is, I think, a great name for anything. And in 1763, sort of coinciding with the end of the French and Indian War, there was a Native American uprising called Pontiac's War. It's during this conflict that we have the origins of a fairly creepy place, and it's called Skull Cave. It's a shallow cave. It's one of these limestone formations, and it looks kind of like a skull. If you squint a little bit. There are other things that are named after things that look a lot more like what they are, but Skull Cave. So 1763 on Mackinac Island, there's a British trader named Alexander Henry who has a fascinating life and a very long, interesting story that is beyond our purview here. But Henry was at Fort Michilimackinac when native forces captured it. He escapes, runs away, goes into a cave, makes a bed out of branches and goes to sleep. It's dark while he's doing all this. When he wakes up, he realizes that something is not quite right. He's lying on something kind of uncomfortable, and he realizes it's a bone. And at first he thought it was a deer bone or something, but then, in his words, quote, "When daylight visited my chamber, I discovered with some feelings of horror that I was lying on nothing less than a heap of human bones and skulls which covered the floor." End quote. Now, archaeologists believe that the cave was probably used as an inhumation, or to use a normal word, a burial site by Native Americans. It wasn't a place, as I saw on some websites, it wasn't a place of human sacrifice or anything like that. It was just, got to put the bodies somewhere, and it's a limestone rock sitting in the lake. So, digging a hole isn't going to work. Because of the spooky history, it's not surprising that it's been the site of weird reports. According to something called the Ghost Quest database, which is apparently a real thing, tourists who visit it frequently report shadow figures, apparitions, and spectral entities, strange feelings of a presence in the vicinity of the cave, and experiencing cold spots and, quote, drops in temperature that defy explanation. I don't think they defy explanation. I just think you haven't bothered to explain it. But it's cold near caves, maybe. It's interesting because there's no, as far as I can tell, there's no report of anything violent, tragic, anything happening at the cave. It's just a place where there were dead people and no longer are. So it's sort of the equivalent of a haunted cemetery, I guess.
Yeah, I just grabbed, I have a copy of Henry's account of the incident that I just grabbed off my bookshelf. And because I just want to double check that I was remembering this correctly, but he's taken there by indigenous people that he's befriended.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
It's not even like he's hiding somewhere he's not supposed to be. The understanding was like, you will not be disturbed here. This is a very sacred place. This is a place that has been used for burials. So it will be a safe place for you. So it's not like anything violent happened there. It is essentially that he hid out in a cemetery for a night. I mean,
and his own telling of it is like the line I quoted. He does make it a little lurid, but he was known as somebody who was a good storyteller. He was
exactly,
a raconteur, and so he's going to make this kind of fun and kind of like My Night in the Mystery Cave of Skulls or something like that.
And he's very young when that happens. He's in his very early 20s too. So I mean, I think his personality really comes through in the way that he tells it.
So the next location that we want to talk about is Fort Holmes. And Fort Holmes is close to my favorite place on the island, I will say. It sits at the highest point on the island. There are stories that folks who go up there at night hear the voices of men who aren't there. And of course, they're attributed to being soldiers. And that's really all I found as far as solid. This is kind of a thing that could happen there. Claire, I don't know if you have heard other stories about things that happen at Fort Holmes.
Not at the fort itself, or not at the highest point of the island itself.
Okay.
The place that people always got the heebie-jeebies. There's two ways to get to Fort Holmes. You can kind of take the long road around the back on the north side, or you can take the stairs straight up. And the stairs, you access the stairs from just to the east of Skull Cave. And the place that I always heard stories about, I'd heard that some psychic was brought to the island and she had a meltdown, was actually at the stairs itself. So that was always the place as you were going up there in the dark with your flashlight to engage in shenanigans, that everyone just kind of ran up the stairs as fast as you could, because that was always the place where people said bad vibes. But I never heard or felt or saw anything, and never really heard anything about Fort Holmes itself.
Now, Fort Mackinac, we've already talked about the history of the fort, so we'll just share some stories and reports of paranormal activity from there. So in the hospital there are reports of feelings of sorrow and seeing phantom limbs.
The one thing I read said there would be a pile of bloody legs in the corner.
And I want to know what that is supposedly from. I mean, there were no amputation. There was no major war. There were very small battles. There were no. There's also two hospitals in the fort too. Just to be clear, there's an earlier hospital within the walls of the fort that was later converted into a storehouse, and then there's a newer hospital outside the walls of the fort, which is now the state park headquarters. So there's two hospitals. Which one are you talking about? Neither one would have had amputated limbs.
not piles.
I mean, that's what I thought was what was happening here between these soldiers.
I think maybe someone got frostbite. I mean, that's the biggest danger for soldiers there. So
yeah, I think these stories develop and people have images in their head. And it's Army hospital, image Civil War Army hospitals of the piles of limbs out back. That's sort of what's probably in people's mind. And I just also love the reports of feelings of sorrow. It's oh gosh, yes, you know what? An abandoned old,
that means you're human.
An abandoned old Army hospital is going to bum you out a little bit. I mean, going to be a little melancholy. So after the wars, the fort was a home for families of the soldiers stationed there. After an outbreak of typhoid, many children died at one point, and there are reports of objects being moved and apparitions of children in the officers' stone quarters.
And I actually don't know of any typhoid outbreak on the island that's been documented, and certainly not one that killed people inside the fort or officers' children. Officers are the only people who had families at the fort. So, but I will say, not the officers' stone quarters, which is where the tea room is today, if you're familiar with the dining option in the fort. Also the oldest public building in the state of Michigan. But the officers' hill quarters, which is directly across from the stone quarters and up the hill, as the name would suggest, that was always the place where I heard stories of hauntings constantly, was the hill quarters. And they were hauntings of children. We do know that it's a duplex, and we do know that the family that occupied, I believe, the east side of the duplex in the 1880s was a couple named Mary Ella and Calvin Coles. And we do know that while they were stationed there, they had two very, very, very young children pass away, Josiah and Isabel. And I know that Isabel had just hit her first birthday, and Josiah, I think, was around 2, no older than that. And my understanding was that they died of a digestive ailment that was hereditary in their family, that they had some issues digesting breast milk, and that kind of caused this kind of wasting sickness in the kids. And they later had a third sibling die of the same thing at a different post, was my understanding. But their quarters was always the place that I did hear stories of. I had a lot of particularly male coworkers who would not go near that building. I had friends who believed that they had seen children's faces in the window. Although these are tiny, tiny kids, so just their little eyes in the window. I also had a friend who was the exhibit cleaner. So her job was to go around and clean the exhibits. And upstairs in that side of the duplex, the kids' rooms, it was period setting. So they were set up to look, toys all over the floor and look like kids had been playing. And the entire door to the room was covered in plexiglass so that visitors could not enter, but they could look in. So you had to get the big suction cups to lift off the plexiglass to get in the room if you needed to clean it. So no one is going in this room except the exhibit cleaner. And she said that every time she went in the room, it was haywire. She said the bed would be moved, the toys would be moved, everything would be moved, just constantly. And I never experienced anything in that building myself. But one of the things, because when I was interpreting there, I was there to represent an officer's wife, right? That was the story that I was there to interpret. So we tried to hang out around the officers' quarters to kind of represent those women's stories. And so I would often, in between demonstrations, hop into the exhibit and play piano to try to, entice guests in with the sound and to start conversation. And the thing that no one prepared me for in museum work was how many visitors come to museums who claim to be psychic and are coming into museums in order to experience a phenomenon. Happened so often. And I remember I was playing the piano and I finished the song that I was playing and turned around to greet visitors and start interpreting. And this woman kind of waved me over to the barrier. And she said, I don't mean to freak you out. But she said, I'm a medium. And she said, I just think that you should know that the children in this house really enjoy your playing.
Oh,
and I was like, that is lovely. And also I have somewhere to go. I'm not going to be, I need to be at a demonstration very quickly. That was the building that I always heard people talk about. And I had a lot of coworkers who just they would take the long way around the fort. They wouldn't walk in front of that building.
I think that's fascinating that there are these experiences and it's children's ghosts, but the sort of history behind it is different than what you see in some of the ghost tales or isn't, as well known in the wider ghost media as it is to people who are involved with the island itself. Yeah.
We used to do this program. I believe that the state park there still does it. It has been a full 10 years since I worked there. But I believe that the state park still does this program called Ghastly Mackinac, which was kind of their answer to a ghost tour. Mm-hmm. Instead of talking about ghost stories, they just tell kind of the more adult stories that that aren't told when you are a family friendly, museum during the day. But I would, when I was the one giving that program, I would mention to guests at the Hill Quarters, we do hear more ghost stories about this building than any other building. But I said, you can imagine why, as a mother or as parents in the Army, you're being shipped off from post to post with very little control, and you're leaving behind two babies here, that are buried in the post cemetery there, and you have to leave, and you don't ever get to come back. I mean, you can imagine the kind of emotional investment there. So I always told guests, like, not supposed to tell you ghost stories, but we do hear more about this building, and to me it makes sense. It's a very tragic story about parents having to leave children behind after a family tragedy, after two family tragedies back to back.
Without question.
Yeah, so speaking of cemeteries, that's sort of next on the list, and I didn't go into detail, and I'm going to move the curtain in the outline that we make before the show. There are 3 cemeteries on the island. St. Anne's is a Catholic cemetery. Then there's the Post Cemetery, which is the military cemetery. And then the Mackinac Island Cemetery, so the general cemetery for the rest of the folks. And they're all sort of located in the same little coming together of a couple different walking paths.
Very close to Skull Cave. Ooh.
I didn't know, Claire, if you had any stories about the cemeteries that you heard, or, I've been, they're fun cemeteries. Historians think walking through cemeteries is fun. So they are fun cemeteries to walk through and explore if you're on the island. But there are some notable folks who are in there if you know the island stories too.
Definitely. There's very interesting people in all 3 of the cemeteries. There's really incredible stones in all 3 of the cemeteries. I mean, it is a historian's dream to be able to walk through them.
I like the arch in front of the...
Yeah, the wall around the Catholic cemetery is so beautiful.
Yeah.
It is a beautiful spot. I have never really heard a lot of stories. People always be like, oh, the Post Cemetery. And I guess for some reason, because it's associated with the military, people think it's freakier.
Mm-hmm.
I never experienced anything there. Well, I turned 21 one of my summers working on the island. And so I was in college and I had a bunch of friends come up to visit. And we all got kicked out of it was the night before my 21st birthday. So we got kicked out of the bars at 10 p.m. because I was a minor. So we couldn't get back in the bar till midnight. So my island friends were like, we had 2 hours to kill. Let's do a night hike. And all my poor college friends who came up and were like in their cute little club outfits were like, we're doing a night what? So one of the places, so we kind of did a long hike. We went to Arch Rock, we went to past Skull Cave, and then we went to the Catholic Cemetery. I worked in the Biddle House Museum, and many of the Biddle, there's a Biddle in every single cemetery on the island. Because the son converted to Protestantism. The Catholic cemetery was always very important to those of us who worked in that house because so many Biddles were in there. So we wanted to go to the cemetery. It was kind of our last stop before we were going to go back downtown and get me my first legal drink. And I had a friend from college who, throughout her life, claimed to experience the paranormal, claimed to be a medium, claimed to see and hear the dead. And she had a couple of experiences all that night. She claimed that she heard a lot of voices and could see eyes looking at her from Skull Cave when we walked by. We were in the cemetery, and I was dating at the time a man who could be very taciturn, could be very silent. And she said that she saw this man in the cemetery who was kind of standing off to the side and not speaking to anyone. And she's like, I thought it was your boyfriend being his normal curmudgeonly self. And then she said she kind of turned around and went to rejoin our group. And my boyfriend was standing with us. And she turned back around and the man that she had seen earlier was not there and was not my boyfriend. So that's really the only story I've ever heard of that I know of in a past life, maybe.
Right.
So that's really the only, and I spent a ton of time in that Catholic cemetery, especially, and never heard any other stories. But like I said, my college friend did say that she had seen someone in the cemetery there.
Okay.
Claire mentioned this earlier. It's a very interesting, unique kind of limestone that the island is comprised of. Because of the way this limestone is, the island is home to a number of interesting and very ancient rock formations and other geological features. And often, but not always, these are linked to legends or myths attributed to the indigenous inhabitants of the island. Now, the degree to which we can trust that these stories are faithful to actual native beliefs is, as we'll see, a little variable. One example is a story collected by the writer Charles Montgomery Skinner, and he related the story of an Ojibwe woman who stood on one of the rocky bluffs overlooking the water, today it's known as Lover's Leap, waiting for her lover who was off fighting a battle. And as she watched the men come back in their canoes, she didn't see her lover. And then she had a vision of what had happened to him. He was tied to a tree with an arrow through his heart. And then she saw his ghost in the air off the edge of this bluff beckoning to her. And she went to him right off the edge of the bluff and to her apparent death. But maybe her spirit and his spirit are off in the air somewhere. Let's go with that. That's what happened, I think.
Another formation that we have is Devil's Kitchen, which just sounds great.
I'd eat there. Sounds like a great restaurant.
As I was telling my friend about it today, I said, "Oh yeah, and then there's Hell's Kitchen." Nope, that is not what this is called. She said, "Well, I'd go there if Gordon Ramsay was there." But no, Devil's Kitchen, and if you like bike around the island, or even just take a walk, sort of. What would that be? Northwestward, kind of from downtown. So that direction. It's a circle. You can't mess that up. Don't head towards Mission Point, and you'll be fine. You can actually see it. There's a sign. I'm noting that is Devil's Kitchen there, and it is a limestone cave, like Skull Cave, and it looks like a face with an open mouth, kind of. So according to author Dirk Gringus in his book Lore of the Turtle, which was published by the Mackinac State Historic Parks in 1970, Native Americans believed that evil spirits, or in some other tellings, giants called red jeebies, inhabited the cave and would consume people who got too close.
And they say that there are dark markings in the mouth of this cave that look like soot from the cooking fires of these cannibal giants, which is really cool. And there's also, very famous formations like Arch Rock, which Tocqueville mentioned in his journey memoir of his journey across America. And that was formed when the Master of Life was so angry at an Ottawa chief that he caused the sun to turn blood red and crash into the earth, making this hole in the rock, and sort of changed the very path of the sun from the night to the day. So that's how we got that.
And then finally, we want to mention Sugarloaf. It is a very tall vertical limestone structure, and sort of in the center-ish of the island. You got to walk around some trails to get up there. It's said to be the dwelling of Gitche Manitou, the Great Spirit. But there's also another telling, which was recorded by our friend Dirk again. And in this book, Lore of the Turtle, he said that the rock was created by Manabozho, or in some Anishinaabeg and Potawatomi what's the word I'm looking for? Translations, it's Nanabozho. So I've seen it both with the M and the N. And he serves a lot of different purposes in storytelling. He's kind of first man. He's learning different things. He serves as a trickster figure sometimes. And that's kind of what makes sense for this story. But in this story, he has kind of gone to retire to Mackinac Island after his life of being first man. And 10 young men were trying to find him, hoping that they would grant their wishes. And after many months, the men arrived at the island that looked like a sleeping turtle, and they found him there in the form of an old man. So then the young men asked Manabozho to grant their wishes, and he grants many of them. They were desiring skills like to be a better dancer, a greater storyteller, amazing hunter, or for a position of authority. All of these wishes were granted, but then the last man approaches him, and he asks for eternal life. And Manabozho becomes angry at the request, for it's the one gift that no mortal can have. That is something that is reserved for the gods. And Manabozho pointed his pipe at the presumptuous young man, and he suddenly began to grow, and his features turned into the towering Sugarloaf, where he remains to this day. And I will say that if you go there, please don't try to climb on Sugarloaf. These are wonderful natural features that are there, all of these features. And they will stay as long as we don't tear them down and ruin them by trying to get pictures and climb and throw rocks and pick things off of them. So admire Sugarloaf. Please don't climb.
Yeah, and this limestone is particularly fragile. I know there's a lot of concerns about how much longer Arch Rock is going to be with us. And I know also with Sugarloaf, that Sugarloaf is 75 feet tall. And I know a couple times while I was there, people climb, especially little kids, climbed it or attempted to climb it and couldn't get down. And the fire department had to get involved. So so another reason to just not, many of these limestone formations are very tall. Many of them extend out over bluffs, and it's just be safe and don't leave them for generations to come. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll probably put some pictures out on social media of some of these features. And if you look at it, like you say, it's sort of a fragile kind of limestone. When you look at it, it doesn't look like the limestone you think of from a quarry or something. It looks almost like coral in some ways.
It's almost like a pudding stone in the way that it comes together.
Yeah. It doesn't look like it should support too many people climbing on it.
Well, and when I was reading about like the geology of the area, it was when sort of there was more water, and so the island was actually covered. And so it's as the Great Lake, which are not the Great Lakes we have today, but as that sort of receded and water levels went down, that's how the island itself, but also many of these foundations came to be formations that we can now see today. And so they were created by erosion and therefore are still susceptible to erosion. So let's not make people erosion one of the things that tears them down.
Exactly.
Yes.
But one thing I found interesting when looking at some of these different Native American legends, and one thing I always want to be cautious of, and so I wondered what you guys thought about it too, is this idea of these non-Indigenous folks. We had the Skinner Fellow. Henry Rowe Schoolcraft is also a famous individual who wrote down a lot of these different Ojibwe legends and things. I know that Dirk Gringus relied on some of his legends, Schoolcraft's legends, in retelling these legends. We always have to be careful, I think, when we're taking an outsider perspective on these legends and not, I don't know what I'm trying to say, but you're nodding, so I know you know what I'm trying to say.
Totally. I mean, Mackinac is so incredibly important to the indigenous people of the Great Lakes. There's a lot of creation stories that center on Mackinac. I've heard some stories where Arch Rock is the bridge between worlds. So it's just a place that I think well before European contact has been invested with a lot of spiritual energy, and that in many ways has been exploited for non-indigenous profit, especially when you look at the history of tourism on Mackinac. And I just think that's important to be careful about. I mean, Henry Rowe Schoolcraft did live on the island for a long time. He was when he was serving as the Indian agent for the Mackinac region, he was diligent by 19th century standards at collecting a lot of this information, but by 19th century standards, and a lot of the information that Schoolcraft collects and publishes is really coming from his wife, Jane. And Jane Johnston Schoolcraft, she's her mother's side of the family was a very powerful Ojibwe family from the Sault Ste. Marie area. And she was a very accomplished oral historian and poet in her own right. And much of what Schoolcraft is publishing is really his wife's incredible wealth of knowledge and her incredible storytelling and poetic ability. And a lot of that has been recovered and published under Jane's name since. But I think it's important to acknowledge where this information is coming from and who's making the money off of it, especially.
Yes.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to sort of mention is Skinner, who where I found that Lover's Leap thing. He wrote a 9-volume collection of stories of our land and then stories of our new land about folklore from after the Spanish-American War. He collected folk stories from the Philippines and Cuba, and talk about commercial motivations for this. There's also some sort of, in a way, cultural and ideological motivations as well, because Skinner had this goal of, as America grew and as America sort of had some founding myths of its own, and he had Paul Bunyan and Johnny Appleseed, he wanted to create sort of an American sort of monomyth out of, or collection of all American myths. So in a way, he was attempting to fold some of these native myths into kind of a generic American myth. But what's interesting is it's not in a chapter about Mackinac or about the Great Lakes. It's in a chapter about Lover's Leap stories. So it's sort of divorced from the culture from which it came. It becomes a generic story about Indians and Indian mythology, which is sort of an endemic issue when dealing with Native American stuff. Is tribal divisions and differences and distinctions get broken down. It just becomes, in quotes, an Indian thing.
Well, yeah, even the stories these legends, if you will, about these formations that we just shared. First of all, they don't always say like this was an Ojibwe legend or this was an Ottawa legend or whatever. So it's just Native American, which assumes that they're a homogeneous group, which they're not. And so there are multiple stories about all of these different places, and we're just sharing the ones that were promoted the most. A lot of them from the Mackinac Island Tourism Bureau's website. But that doesn't mean that that's the definitive end. Oral traditions are rich and change between group and even family. And so the nature of tale of legend is, hard to pin down. So just keep that in mind as you think about the stories that we just shared.
And I think this is a good point to take a little break. Next time, the Circleville Letters.
You can subscribe to Great Lakes Lore at greatlakeslore.com or wherever you find podcasts. And be sure to follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at Great Lakes Lore. The links are in the show notes. And wherever you listen, give us a rating or a review if possible. That really helps in the inner workings of the interweb systems.
It's all magic.
It is.
And by the time you're listening to this, or within hours of you listening to this, the Chizo Media Patreon should be live with bonus material available from Great Lakes Lore and the Saucer Life. And we're going to have all sorts of information on social media about what kinds of extra content will be available there for you. But be sure to check that out at patreon.com/Chizo Media, or check out the link in the show notes.
We'd love to get your comments and questions about this episode, so reach out to us on social media or in email. You can count on any of the numerous posts that go out wherever you follow us. And I know we promised you last time that during our midway break, we are going to talk about the books that we're reading for the Astonishing Legends Book Challenge. But this is a very long episode. We have a very long outline to work through. And so we are actually going to record a little something separate and release it where Aaron and I will talk about the books that we read for January.
Yes, and I think it's high time we get back to the island.
So now we're going to talk about a location on the island, and it has quite a history attached to it. This type of building you find throughout the United States, and the unfortunate fact of the matter is that though the island had an important and a revered place in the indigenous cultures of the region, once Europeans began moving in and battling over the land, the Native Americans were used as pawns in their wars. Then after the War of 1812, they were a population that needed to be managed according to these Europeans. And part of that came through work to basically wipe out their culture, civilize them, make them more like these the European cultures that were coming into the this part of the world. And so in 1825, the mission house was constructed on Mackinac Island, and it served as a boarding school for Native American children. Now, these kinds of boarding houses or boarding schools were an unfortunate staple, if you will, in the awful plans for Americans to manage and sort of wipe out Native culture. Children were ripped from their homes, parents were kept away from them, they cut their hair, they weren't allowed to speak their languages, and these boarding schools are the reason behind the loss of many indigenous languages. So roughly 500 students attended the school during the about a decade that it was open, and 16 of those students did end up passing away while they were at the school.
So there are many stories circulating on the internet with regard to the poor treatment and subsequent deaths of students at the school, especially those who came down with tuberculosis. And all these sources report that the students were brought to the cool basement where it was thought the cool air would help them, help treat the tuberculosis or relieve their illness. Today, the school is referred to as being one of the most haunted buildings on the island, with apparitions of children and cries and screams. Regardless of whether or not the school is truly haunted in the way popular culture has taught us to think of hauntings, it has an incredibly haunting history that shouldn't be overlooked, not for its shock value, but for the trauma held within its walls and how schools like this harmed indigenous peoples throughout the country. In the late 1830s, the school closed and was sold, becoming a hotel. It had a few different iterations as such, and then in 1946, it was purchased and used as a conference center for the moral rearmament movement, which will be discussed further when Mission Point Resort is talked about. In the 1960s, the building had a short stint as a liberal arts college, which failed, and in the 1970s, it was purchased by the Mackinac State Historic Parks.
Yeah, and now today it is the living quarters for the seasonal staff for Mackinac State Historic Parks, which means that this is the building that I lived in for all the time that I was living on Mackinac Island. So I'm very well acquainted with Mission House and its many stories, for sure.
All right. Are there any you'd like to share or tell us a little bit about?
This is another situation where I never personally experienced anything at the Mission House, but I lived on the third floor all 5 years that I was there. And the third floor was added as part of its conversion into a hotel in 1841. And so I never knew anyone who had any experiences on the third floor.
Mm-hmm.
It was, it's the equivalent of like haunting a La Quinta. I mean, no one wants to, if I die in a hotel, I'm not sticking around. But for friends who were living in the floors and the parts of the building that were an active part of the residential school, it was a very active place where my friends were constantly complaining of paranormal activity, disturbing them in their sleep. My friend Joe was particularly shaken one morning, waking up and finding on the single pane glass in his room children's handprints.
Oh.
Yeah, he still talks about that as being something that shook him up quite badly. On the east wing of the home, which was especially in the second floor area, which is where like my kitchen was, and then a couple of my friends had bedrooms, People would routinely say that they were seeing children there. There was a little boy that people often saw. There was a lot of stories about a little boy with a red ball, but I think they're confusing. I think that's a leftover from the movie Somewhere in Time, which was filmed on the island. I
Yep.
don't think that's actually connected to the school. And then on the west wing of the building, which was the building was separated, at least when I lived there, into a men's side and a women's side. And on the men's side of the home, that was where the instructors, where the missionaries and the teachers themselves were living. And those people on the women's side of the building, my friends would report seeing kids or handprints and things like that. But there wasn't anything that ever felt malevolent. Like I had a friend who her stuff would just get moved all the time during the night. Her alarm clock would get shut on and off. And one night we all fortified ourselves with quite a bit of tequila and went in and had very curt words with this young man about how you're not to move things anymore. And it stopped. So it was very, at least in the east wing of the building, it was quite mischievous in nature. But on the west wing of the building, where the adults had been living historically during the time that it was a school, the stories that my friends had were a little bit more sinister. I remember my friend John saying multiple times that he would wake up to feeling like someone was sitting on his bed, not on your chest like a sleep paralysis thing, but that someone had sat on his bed. I had several friends report seeing shadows of men. They could tell that they were men from the hats that they were wearing on the walls of the building in the kitchen, which was the Ferries, the Reverend and William and his wife Amanda. It was their quarters in that area. Or on the porch, they would see kind of this malevolent shadow of a male figure. And then for a lot of my friends who lived in what had kind of been the dormitory area of the building, there was just kind of like this unspoken agreement that you didn't leave your room at night. Like no matter how badly you had to use the restroom, you did not go down the hall. You did not open your door. That there was just a real squicky feeling in that hallway in the night. So, nothing other than I would say the stuff moving and my friend Joe's handprints on the windows, which he did call me in and I did see and were quite vivid. There wasn't anything too concrete, but it was definitely a building that you were always very aware of its history in. So, and it was especially remarkable. Because of the nature of the stories that we were interpreting, we always had Native American interpreters who that was their specific job. I mean, I had a lot of friends working for the parks who were also of Indigenous ancestry from the area. And then we also had people who were employed specifically to interpret Indigenous history and Indigenous history alone. And I knew people who had gone to residential schools in Harbor Springs, the residential school in Harbor Springs, Michigan, Holy Child of Jesus, into the 1980s. That school closed in 1986. Yeah, and so to know that you had friends who had experienced a residential school and that you were living in a very early example of a residential school, that was omnipresent, whether you were experiencing paranormal phenomenon or not, for sure.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's move on a little bit then. We'd have a bit of tourism to talk about now at this point. And we're going to start with Mission Point Hotel because it's Mission Point Resort, because its history is tied directly to the Mission House, which we were just talking about. And so after the Civil War, tourism to Mackinac Island really started to pick up. And then by the late 1800s, it's a tourist hotspot for sure. So Mission Point Resort is one place that I had always heard a very specific story about. But first, I'll give you a little bit of history. So keep the Mission House in mind. In 1946, the Moral Rearmament Movement acquired the Mission House, what was the boarding school, no longer a boarding school. And this was a movement that had begun in England in 1938, basing their mission in the idea that arming yourselves morally would help to solve the problems of the world. So 1938, this is, the years leading up to, and things are starting to really take shape for World War II. So Europe is in a state that the United States is not thinking about quite yet at that moment. But the movement starts there, and they had already been utilizing the Island House Hotel for conferences immediately following World War II. But in 1946, they set about creating their own center. So in the 1950s, more buildings were constructed in addition to the Mission House. and including a theater and soundstage at which they produced even their own motion pictures. And a few of the titles I found listed were The Crowning Experience, Voice of the Hurricane, and Decision at Midnight. I've never seen any of these. No idea what exactly they are.
I was fascinated by just this idea of the moral rearmament movement, and I sort of was Googling it earlier today, and Glenn Close was raised in it.
Yeah, she speaks of it very negatively as it being a very, very negative experience. Yeah.
All right. So by the mid-1960s, the movement decided to ditch its island properties and deemed them to Mackinac College, which was supposed to be a liberal arts college and located on Mackinac Island. It surprisingly failed by
like
1970. So surprising. So the buildings that had been constructed then operated as a religious retreat center and educational institution, which also sounds vaguely unsettling. Mm-hmm. And by 1972, it was transformed into a resort. And so the one ghost story that I had heard about Mission Point and actually saw a Ghost Hunters episode where they talk about this ghost is a young man named Harvey. And it is said that Harvey was at the resort while it was I couldn't find for sure whether it was the college or the religious center. Not little vague there. And he was so brokenhearted that a woman did not return his affections that he went into the woods behind the resort and he shot himself. His body wasn't found for 6 months. And there are rumors that were started by a certain somebody that we're going to talk a little bit about at the end of this episode, that it wasn't suicide because 2 bullet holes were found in his head and there was no gun nearby. It is said that Harvey still haunts the resort and the theater in particular. An article I found online by a former seasonal employee who had another job actually working at the fort, it seemed, and then also gave some of these ghost tours for the Haunts of Mackinac ghost tours, said that she had an encounter with Harvey. She said that on one tour, her group was in the theater at Mission Point, and she heard a dragging sound behind the curtain. She thought it was her fellow guide trying to freak her out, and she called out for him to stop, and she heard his voice from another direction saying, what are you talking about? I'm not doing anything. And so they were like, oh, what was it? So they threw back the curtain and turned on the light, and there was nobody back there, just the chair sitting there, which she presumes she heard being drug across the floor. Now, in the episode of Ghost Hunters that I watched, this was many years ago, I will say, and I subscribe to no streaming service that provides me access to Ghost Hunters back episodes right now. I believe that they tried doing some historical research and found no actual record of anybody named Harvey because in these stories, he's never given a last name. And I did a little bit of research myself on newspapers.com and also with combinations of search things like Mission Point Resort and Harvey and suicide and murder. Like nothing was coming up. So I know, Claire, when you quick glanced at the outline, you had some thoughts on this too.
Yeah, I mean, I had never heard this particular story before, and it just, there's only been one, at least in the 20th century, only one murder on Mackinac that gets talked about. A tourist was assaulted and murdered on the island. And the murderer never caught. And that story gets so much kind of press and is so well known, at least among staff members and park employees, that I just thought, like, God, I would have heard about this. That I would have, and especially I lived next door for years. I would have heard about this. So, I have friends who were part of the only graduating class at Mackinac College and know the Mission Point campus very well. So I was like, I swear I would have heard something like this. So it just seems a little far-fetched.
I was going to say, it's a small place. It's something like this. Everybody would know about it and everybody would be talking about it for forever.
Yeah. And my theory, as you'll see when I talk about a story in a few seconds, is that if a bunch of drunk college kids weren't spreading the story around, then it didn't happen. There's no way that it could have existed because when you get all of those the Ford employees, all the seasonal employees for the fudge shops, the coffee shops, the hotels, all of restaurants, the carriage tour drivers who are known to make up stories, from what I've been told.
Yes. They are storytellers.
Yes. If we would have heard about it.
Yeah, and there's also some stories about the Grand Hotel, and if no matter where you are in this world, if you know anything about Mackinac Island, you might know about the Grand Hotel. If you are of a certain age or you like movies, you have seen it in Somewhere in Time. As Claire mentioned the film before, Christopher Reeve and Jane Seymour. I had to watch it in my high school history class because my teacher liked it. So we watched Somewhere in Time.
I've never actually seen it.
How do you ruin Superman and time travel?
It is schmaltzy. Oh. It's not good.
The Grand Hotel was this sort of Gilded Age symbol of excess. It opened in 1887, and you can actually see the hotel from the shores of the lower peninsula of Michigan. Looking out over the straits to the island, you can actually see the hotel. It's got a front porch that is 600 feet long, which is one of the things it's known for. And if you want more information about it, you can go to historichotels.org, and they will tell you everything you need to know.
It's a long history they've got on there. Lots of architectural stuff I kind of glazed over.
Yeah. If that's your thing, knock yourself out. But we're here for ghosts. So there are stories that when the hotel was built, so many skeletons were found during the building process that the builders couldn't keep track, and they continued building. And I had a question about this. Where were they finding these? Was this in the ground they were finding them, or...
I don't know. There's just not that much topsoil on the island is the problem. Is that they've always struggled to bury people on the island. And also where the Grand Hotel was, there's been a lot of different things. It was pasture land for a long time. There was a distillery there at one point during the War of 1812 where all the townspeople hid out while the British attacked. So, I mean, the idea that we would go until 1887 and not have that land disturbed and have a massive burial ground discovered is hard to believe.
Yeah, I was looking at this and I was thinking about the geology of the islands. Like, so many skeletons they couldn't keep count. It just sounds like
this is a common story though, because so when the summer that I worked on the island, I mentioned that I worked for Starbucks, and it was a renovation of a previous downtown business. I forget what it was before that, and so they had to redo a bunch of stuff, and redoing in the basement and stuff, and I don't know where the story came from, who told it. They're like, oh yeah, I heard that they found bones down there and didn't actually report it and just kept building. So it is a very common, and I think it's just because it's like, well, there were Native Americans here, and there was war here, and there was this here, so there are clearly bones everywhere on the island.
And then meanwhile, while all of that is like this kind of repetitive, oldie-timey, there's got to be bones in the ground kind of story, just down the street, it did actually happen. When McNally Cottage was torn down to create, I believe, where is now the Bicycle Inn, all of us at the state park were like, they're going to find bones there because that's where the Catholic Church was originally and where the original Catholic cemetery was before it was moved up to its current location when the church was moved. And all of us at the state park were like, they're going to find bones. They're going to find bones. And then what do you know? They found bones. So it's like, it does happen, but there's a reason for it. It's not just kind of this like generic oldie-timey, the Indians, there's bones. Right. It just feels like such a myth of pseudo history that comes up again and again.
Yeah, we've disturbed the ancient burial ground.
Yes,
and
exactly.
Now bad things are going to happen.
Very poltergeist.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's the movie I was thinking of.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So it just when I read that, it's like, it sounds like one of those things that they say in order to set up the ghost story they're going to tell in about 45 minutes. So
it was probably the carriage tour drivers that made that up.
100%. 100%. They're in it for tips, and I don't blame them.
So there's also stories of people at the hotel seeing entities in period clothing. I presume that's Gilded Age period clothing, probably. It's one of those phrases that you read, and it's like, oh yeah, which period?
I will say that the website I said Victorian era clothing, and I got
we're not going to say that here.
So.
No, that's wrong.
I changed it to period clothing.
Period. I just wanted to clarify the period.
But also, why couldn't there be a flapper? Why couldn't there
Right.
be a flapper ghost?
Yeah.
I would love to meet a
It's-
flapper ghost.
Or from the 80s. I mean, it's
Yeah.
been a hotel for over 100 years.
Yeah, I mean, you see people in double knit polyester and bell bottoms and wide
Truly
collars.
terrifying.
Yeah, it
Truly
would be
terrifying.
It really disco Mackinac. Yeah, it would be deeply
A bunch
troubling.
of 1950s drunk yachtmen.
Bingo.
Yes.
Apparently, ghosts can only exist from the 19th and early 20th centuries. They have to be from that period.
I want to
Yes.
see some beatnik ghosts. That's
Yes.
all I
Well,
really
they
want to
couldn't
see.
be at the hotel though.
No, they'd be there, then get kicked out, and then come back
Right.
to haunt it later. So there's one report that a group of maintenance workers saw a large dark entity with glowing red eyes, and the entity rushed at one of them and knocked him out, and he ended up going to the hospital. This sounds very, very strange, and I just love that it's a glowing-eyed entity.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
That's what the story
Claire,
said.
have you heard about that one?
No, I haven't heard that one. I do have a friend of mine, a former state park employee who for a couple of years, right around the time that I left the park, was actually the winter watchman for the Grand Hotel. So he was the
Ooh.
on-site security for the winter.
It's very Stephen King.
He said it was very Shining-esque. Yeah, he was like, it was very, he felt like Jack Nicholson. But, and he's the kind of person where if there had been red glowing eyes, I would have heard about it immediately from this person. And he had nothing to report other than a general sense of creepiness. So.
There's other reports. I like this one. There's a man in the piano bar wearing a top hat, often accompanied by the smell of cigar smoke. So that's a nice sort of multi-sensory paranormal experience.
That does just happen with living people, though. I mean, in the piano bar, which is also a cigar bar. So that could be just a living person in the corner with a top hat.
I mean, I'm sure that the walls and the furniture, everything's absorbed so much smell that a muggy day happens, and it's just like, it's a time when smoking was allowed everywhere again.
So there's some interesting stories on Mackinac Island, but there's also some stories that, as you might have heard and picked up on so far, there's some things you have to be wary of when looking at these stories.
Yeah, so when I was doing my research, I came across the story of the drowning pool, and this was something I had never heard of before. And the story goes that in the 1700s and early 1800s, and that's how it's written every single time. It is, I found the story. 7 women were accused of being witches and drowned in a pool of water just inland from the straits in front of Mission Point Resort. So if you're familiar with the island and you're walking down sort of the main road towards Mission Point Resort, there's a point where you can veer off to what would be your right, and you can take a little bicycle trail that goes closer to the water. And there is sort of this little, I don't know my geology terms, a lagoon, an estuary, a puddle of water that is large and deep. I'm not sure what word would be the most appropriate for this.
I like lagoon.
Yeah, I do too. Maybe there's a mermaid inside. And so there were these women who were accused of being witches, and so they needed to be tested to see if they were witches. So they were going to dunk them, and if they survived the dunking, they were witches. If they died, they weren't. But whoops. And as I mentioned, it's a story I never heard of. It wasn't part of the carriage tours. Nothing was shared between us college folks on the island for a long summer where you're secluded from everybody and stories get told. And I even came across some other stories that said that this pool was actually a 20th century creation. Something that I read said it was one of the more recent owners of the Mission Point Resort who, in doing work, this pool ended up being created. Something else I read said it was the Morrill Rearmament Act had used that area as like a marina, and so they kind of had altered that landscape there a bit, but definitely didn't exist prior to 1900. And so this raised all of my history hackles. And so every iteration of the story that I found online, and it was largely being shared by radio stations, newspapers, news stations, things like that. And then other just general haunted places in the state kind of sites. They all pointed back to Todd Clements, who was the author of Haunts of Mackinac and the owner of the Haunts of Mackinac tours. And nothing beyond this. And so it appears that the story originated with him. The wording, as I mentioned, is the same in every way it's told. Says 1700s and early 1800s, which is very weirdly, it's very weirdly unspecific, I guess, is what I feel. And again, it said these women worked at the brothels that were in the town. And, in order to sort of weed out some of this bad activity, they thought, let's accuse them of witchcraft and drown them. And, as I said.
And that would be so remarkable for the 18th and 19th centuries,
Yes.
especially in this area, to hear accusations of witchcraft. That would be so remarkable that I think some historian would have seized on that by now if it had an iota of truth in it.
We'd all be sharing the stories of the witches of Mackinac Island. Were it
Right.
Exactly.
And the water test thing is such a European thing rather than a North American thing. It's history-ish, right? It sounds like it could be a real historical story because, well, there were witches and witchcraft and witch hunts in Salem and witch trials throughout New England and, in other states as well during the 1690s. So it's just 100 years later and it's all the olden days. So, why wouldn't this have happened here?
And all of these articles also shared the very same picture of the dunking, like the same exact old black and white sketch, but there's like no source or anything. So as like a reader who doesn't know history, though, they would read that and think, whoa, this actually came from Mackinac Island, and it makes
and that's exactly what I was going to say too, is that it just, those kinds of stories feel like they're preying on people's lack of familiarity with the past. And I really do mean preying. I mean, it feels very exploitative because it's usually for cash. It's usually for a tour or a book or something like that. So it does feel extremely exploitative of saying, you're not a historian. You maybe haven't had a history class in a long time, but generic old timey things. I'm gonna exploit that and make a buck off it, and it just feels icky.
It's very icky.
And it's, I mean, not to generalize, but the paranormal field is a massive grift, and I say that with affection, but
and always has been. It's very historically accurate.
It always has been. Sam, what you're talking about with these stories are on all these websites, sort of word for word. I mean, I'm not sort of saying this is what it was, but it sounds like somebody's sending out a press release. It sounds.
Or they did their own Google search of, it's Halloween time. I need to make an article for our news station website about haunted places. Ooh, witches in Michigan. That'll get attention.
Yep.
Exactly.
And the thing is, I was listening to a podcast the last couple days. It's called Haunted Road, and it's hosted by Amy Bruni, who was a member of Ghost Hunter, or a crew member for the TAPS team, the Ghost Hunter folks, back a long time ago. And I know she has another TV show right now. I don't get that channel. But so I was listening to the podcast, though, and she was interviewing the current owners of the Conjuring house. And, they were talking about how essentially the same thing has happened with, some of the characters who've been associated as the evil characters inside of the house, the Conjuring house. And that when you go to the actual historical records, like that's just not the case. But everybody thinks that Bathsheba is like the evil lady who killed a baby or whatever it is. And so, I think there are people who are doing good work and trying to share what the true story is. And I like to think that as us historians who are also interested in this stuff, we're kind of doing the same thing as well. And I know, Claire, you had a specific story that has been, it's sort of the thing that raises your historian hackles, a Mackinac Island one.
Yeah.
So it was something I wasn't familiar with. So if you want to share that.
Yeah. And in fairness, I don't know that I ever really heard it in person. I heard it once in person that I can confirm. And so I don't know how long it kind of propagated, but, and it was on Todd Clements' Haunts of Mackinac tour. Full disclosure, I don't know Todd very well. We've met at a couple parties. We have mutual friends. And a lot of my friends worked for him part-time in addition to working for the state park. and had really good experiences with him as a boss. So don't in any way, shape, or form mean this as any sort of personal indictment. But I do know that there was one particular story that was told on the Haunts of Mackinac tour that I found really deeply disturbing. And it was a story about Magdalaine LaFramboise. And if you're not familiar with this woman, Google her immediately. She's the coolest. She's just the coolest, like top of my list of like Michigan women to know. She was a Métis woman of mixed French and Odawa descent. She married a French fur trader, Joseph LaFramboise. They had 2 children. And while their children were still very, very small, her husband was killed, allegedly murdered. They had a trading post near the Grand River in the Lower Peninsula during the winter, and then they would come up to Mackinac in the summer. And when her husband was murdered in the early 19th century, she took over his trade and kind of built it into a quite impressive trading company that I think gave the American Fur Company on Mackinac a little run for its money, at least made them a little bit nervous. Mm-hmm. Anyway, she had this very large and impressive home, which today is the kind of offices and lobby area of a hotel on the island, which I always made my parents stay at because I just wanted to be in the hotel and be in her house. Which is right next to the Catholic Church on the island, because she is the one, when the Catholic Church outgrew its original building, she was the one who donated the land for the new construction. Her daughter married the commandant of Fort Mackinac, Benjamin Pierce, who was the brother of President Franklin Pierce.
Oh, wow.
She was very well connected. I mean, she's just an amazing, amazing woman. And after her death, she was given a very important burial within St. Anne's Church. And when the church was remodeled in the 1870s, her burial was moved initially to kind of the front yard garden area of the church. And now you can visit her burial site. She's been moved again into the church's museum area in the basement. But one of the stories that I heard early on in the Haunts of Mackinac tours was that her body during the renovation of the church had been misplaced or uncovered, and that no one knew what these bones were. And so her bones were strung up as a Halloween skeleton decoration.
Oh.
And I just found that to be, I mean, deeply untrue. Her burial has always been given a place of pride and respect in acknowledgement of her contributions. But also really, I think, disturbing given the fact that she is a woman of Odawa ancestry, given what we understand about the history of the treatment of Indigenous people's bodies and graves.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I just found that whole story to be deeply disturbing and disrespectful, and ignored an opportunity to tell a really amazing story of a really amazing woman. You know, my fear was that people are leaving Mackinac, and the only time they hear Magdalaine LaFramboise's name is in the context of this fake story. I don't know how long that story was told as part of the tour. I don't know if it still is. I don't know, but I found that to be deeply disturbing.
Yeah, so there are other just some inaccuracies. I mean, because the thing that I also find troubling, I guess, just to use that word again, is these paranormal groups who will go in and they'll do their own investigation or whatever, and then they'll come back and they'll share their findings online, but then the history isn't accurate there either. So I'm not going to go through the list of items that I found, but Haunted Travels of Michigan, they had some things confused, timeline things. There's aroundmichigan.com had some weird phrases and just some generalizations in this list of 51 haunted places that they had. And so these are the things that, I like creepy history. When I went to Charleston, I did a pirate ghost walking tour because you're in Charleston. So it's a fun thing to do, right? And so, as a person who likes to engage in some of this, we had the conversation about dark tourism versus haunted tourism in one of our previous episodes. But if that's something that you enjoy learning about because of the history involved in it, and wondering about the afterlife, whatever it might be, you're going to find these inaccuracies all over the web, and it's just as a historian, it's just so upsetting because it's not that hard to find the correct information. A lot of the things that we shared with you in this episode, we found actually from the Mackinac State Historic Parks website and the Mackinac Island Tourism Bureau's website. They have an incredible website that's filled with information about the various historical buildings, residents of the island, things to do, the history of the island itself, the fort. I mean, all kinds of things can so easily be found on those reputable websites that it's like, why'd you mess this up here though? So
Yeah.
And so many publications, I mean, especially a place like Mackinac or a place like Charleston, I mean, these are places that have enormous historical significance. And so they're certainly written about and researched about. And there's so many, I mean, I just pulled like a handful of books off my shelf to double check things for myself tonight. And it's just, there's no end to the information that is available publicly and very, very easily. So when you see mistakes like that, you start to wonder if they're mistakes. It is really kind of the feeling I get, which is what I think feels icky.
Yeah. It's disingenuous in a lot of cases. I'm not sure this is the best word for it, but I think there's a lot of laziness involved. It's like, just things like things being in the wrong place or timelines being out of order. Nobody's going to check this. I don't care. People are reading this for a ghost story. They're not reading it for history. So it doesn't matter if I get the order of these things wrong, or I put something in the wrong place, or I describe a geographical location that doesn't actually exist in the way that everybody else thinks it does. It doesn't matter, because who cares? That's irritating, because people read these things, I think, thinking they are getting sort of like, well, I'm getting a ghost story, but I'm also learning about the history of Mackinac. And did you know that, blah, 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 10 things that are wrong.
And I think the examples that we've talked about tonight from Mackinac to really show the danger of that, because I will put up with a certain amount of that when we're talking about a haunted hotel and glowing red eyes and a man in a top hat. I will put up with a certain amount of that laziness if you get the year wrong and blah, 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 blah. But so many of the stories around Mackinac involve Indigenous history. So much of the spookiness is kind of from that, an Indian burial ground or a residential school for Indigenous children. And I just think there's so much of that kind of baked into a lot of myth making and narrative in American history that I think you have to be so careful with. And especially when we are talking about ghost stories or dark tourism, you want to make sure that you're not sensationalizing a history that is already factually very dark and very exploitative. And make sure that you're not furthering that in a way that is really destructive.
Yes. And sort of to sort of tag on to that, because you are dealing with Indigenous peoples and places that are sacred to Indigenous peoples, this inaccuracy, this laziness, this wrongness in the context of paranormal stories is another way that the paranormal field, I'm using sarcasm quotes, the paranormal field is sort of fairly exclusionary. You look at the names, you look at the people, you look at the personalities, it's demographically very homogenous. And so this is, I think, an example of another way that the paranormal field has some work to do.
Totally.
Think about the stories that we shared that had sort of the messed up histories and stuff. They deal with Native American stories and with women. So it's they are the others. And so there's an otherness about their stories that we can exploit, that we can get some money off of, because mainstream whoever is going to already have a little hint there that there's something creepy or could be unsettling or could be whatever. And so you're playing off of these stereotypes and prejudices that already exist.
Absolutely.
And I think Mackinac, too, on the flip side, though, offers us such a great example of what the opposite of that would look like, of what examining the paranormal or the supernatural or the spiritual from a historical perspective in good faith can look like. Mackinac has been a center of spirituality for literally thousands of years. There has been so much spiritual energy invested in this place, from Indigenous belief to, a very, very early French mission to this early 19th century war between the Protestant and Catholic missionaries on the island. I mean, I think there is so much rich history and so many moments where people are experiencing the worst days of their life in a place like Mackinac. And I think there's so much opportunity to explore those ideas in a really healthy and historically accurate, but also curious way. So I think Mackinac, for me, has always been an opportunity to examine those ideas in a much more good faith approach too.
So one final question that I had, because I had a whole list of sort of wrap up points, and I think we've slowly been sort of tackling them all without saying it. But it was something Claire and I were messaging back and forth earlier today, preparing for this. And she said something I found interesting and had never thought of before, but that when people are sort of making up or sensationalizing these stories, what effect does that have on folks who truly have experienced things? And so I wondered if you wanted to say a little something about that.
Well, I one of the things I noticed that when I was working for the state park at the time, again, this was over a decade ago, we introduced this tour called the Ghastly Mackinac Tour, which was our answer to the Haunts of Mackinac tour. And it was a tour that was completely historically accurate, did not talk about ghosts, but talked about some really heavy subjects. And when we were developing that tour, among the staff members, there was just kind of always this fear of like, can I come right out and say like, yeah, I saw a ghost there? I mean, it was always this kind of like, am I a bad historian if I say I had this experience or I had this feeling or this thing happened to me that I can't explain? Am I renouncing my professional credentials by saying that? And I think it's really important for us as public historians to be open to engaging with that. Again, you're going to have visitors come through who do believe in it. You're going to have visitors come through. Again, I was shocked at the number of visitors I've had in my career who are like, I'm here because I'm a medium and that's what I'm here for. And I want to share with you what I've heard. Or, even in a less kind of supernatural way, just the sheer number of museums I've worked in that have human remains in their collection. Or, when I left Mackinac, I went and did an internship with the Little Traverse Bay Bands of Odawa Indians in their human remain repatriation program. And so, I mean, you're dealing with subjects that are going to bring up a lot of ideas about the paranormal, about spirituality. And I think it has been helpful for me in situations where I've been on a staff that has made it a safe place for us as museum professionals and public historians to say, if you've had this experience, you can talk about it. The things that I did experience happened in a museum when we were open. And I was like, well, that just happened to me. And now I have to go do my job, and I'm very unsettled right now. So yeah, I think that has been an important part of what has made me successful or unsuccessful in a job, is how safe I felt in being able to explore some of those ideas that I believe are going to come up when you work in history.
And I think, having worked in two different historic house museums, I mean, you're every day in a space where people lived, where people died, where they're, where they were laid out for their viewings or whatever. And yeah, whether it's, your own thoughts or things that happened, because I am confident that things happened as well. One time shortly before a program was supposed to happen as well. Yeah, there's always that moment of like, well, if someone on a tour asks, though, what do I tell them? Or, where I was the director at my last house museum, but where I currently work, I get people who ask me, and I've never had weird feelings in this house or anything like that. But I always wonder, like, but what if my boss found out and I told these people, like, some, it's so it makes you wonder. And it's something I think that we all should be able to grapple with and talk about. And so until you brought that up, I never really thought too hard about it, but I was like, this is an interesting point worth exploring.
Yeah, I mean, so my research, again, I'm just finishing up my dissertation as part of my PhD, and my research focuses on the issue of authenticity in living history interpretation. And I'm examining that both in the context of authenticity as historical accuracy, but also in the role that authenticity plays as an authentic human connection. And how important is that when it comes to history education and historic interpretation? And I think that is part of having an authentic connection with a guest. If a guest comes to you and says, this is really important to me, this is why I'm at a historic site, I would like to connect with you on this. And if you personally feel comfortable exploring that, I think that's a great way to make a connection with a guest and to spark a conversation about real history. I think just because we're talking about the paranormal doesn't mean as I think we've certainly proven tonight, doesn't mean that you're not talking about accurate history. I think it can be a great opening for that conversation.
Yeah. Oh yeah, and I am always honest, just to throw that out there. But but yeah,
but you need to make sure that you don't have repercussions from supervisors in that situation. And I think there are situations and supervisors where you could be worried about that legitimately.
Well, I was just going to say that part of the trepidation, the whole am I selling out my professional credentials by acknowledging this, is sort of goes back to the fact that the paranormal does not have a good reputation as far as, regardless of is it true or not. It's just, this is a field that attracts, griftiness.
Charlatans.
Yes, that's perfect.
But I love what you said about having it be a way to connect with visitors to a location, because I know in teaching, I have to be very careful not to just tell students, oh, that's, if they I saw this video on YouTube and blah, blah, blah. YouTube's dumb. You should read books. Yeah, I'm not going to, I'm not going to say that, because I would like them to take another history class and to learn more, to have more perspective. And you can't sort of sacrifice these connections on the altar of adhering to a strict definition of what a history professional should always do in every circumstance. So I think that's a really good point you made.
And history has many sort of entry points, right? Like it is literally the story of human existence. And so, there are so many things that a person can be interested in. And if that's what their interest is, then no problem with it. if that's where the angle that you want to look at things from, if that's what brings you to the museum and gets you asking questions and makes you curious, then I'm going to feed that curiosity as best as I can, because that's what makes us thoughtful, critical thinkers.
I had an example from Colonial Williamsburg. I went on their tour. They're one of my case studies for my dissertation. And I went on their kind of ghosty, haunty tour. And I really liked the approach that they took on the tour that I was on. I don't know if they change it, but there were 3 different stories. There was one story that was kind of a very traditional, we're in this old house, here's the stories, staff has heard bumps in the night, etc. The second story was that the ghost that had been allegedly viewed or photographed was the ghost of a contemporary interpreter who had passed away. So that story was not just about oldie-timey ghosts, but it was about kind of the museum as a workspace and who works here and who does this job. And then the final story that they told was they brought us into an 18th century dining room and they sat us around the table and they said, what do you do after a dinner party? You might tell a couple ghost stories. And they told us an 18th century ghost story. And I love that idea of, we have always told these stories. We have always been interested in these questions. What did people in the period that we're studying think about the supernatural? How did they approach it? And I loved really that. Cool. I thought that was so well done.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Claire, for joining us. And this has been fascinating from a supernatural perspective and a historical perspective. And we promise we are not on the payroll of the Tourism Board of Mackinac Island, but it is an amazing place. And if they would like to give us a cut, we would welcome it. So if you go to Mackinac Island, tell them you heard about Mackinac Island here on the show, and we'd appreciate that. But thank you, Claire, and I think that about wraps it up.
Thank you for having me. This has been such a pleasure, you guys.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening.
The Haunting History of Mackinac was written by Samantha Engel and produced by Aaron Gullius and Samantha Engel, and special appearance by Claire.
Our music is by Raphael Crux.
Great Lakes Lore is a Chizo Media production. Chizo Media, our heart is with the people.
Until next time, don't get lost in the lore. Hey everybody, it's Samantha. I need to add a bit of a postscript to this episode. There was something that I said while recording that when I said it, I thought, ooh, that's not quite right. But I just kept talking, as one sometimes does while recording. And the next morning, I still felt kind of icky and weird and bad about it. So I texted Aaron and said that I needed to correct this wrong. So I'm recording this after the fact. And if you recall, when I'm discussing the history of the Mission House boarding school, I mentioned that the Europeans used the indigenous people as pawns in their, conquests for land and things. And the fact of the matter is that is a very two-dimensional look at what was going on, because of course they thought that's what they were doing, but this view really takes away all of the agency that the Native Americans had, because they too were trying to ally themselves with those that they thought would, respect their treaties, respect their land, where they were living and trading and working and everything. And also would, just kind of respect their culture. And in some cases that meant kind of leave us alone to our thing up here. And so there are times when they feel that the French are going to do this. There are times actually during the during the War of 1812, when they think the British are going to be the ones to ally themselves with, because the Americans clearly are going to want to push westward and take over anything. And so I really just wanted to make sure that I shared this note with you, because it's important to me to get history right and to share these stories from really all perspectives. And so everybody was, they were making decisions. They were, working to improve or preserve, the ways of life that they had. And so the way I said it, I just wasn't quite comfortable with. So hopefully this all makes sense. And you have a little bit of a better idea about some of these alliances and things that were going on.